6:30. Good evening, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So I guess we'll get officially started at 6:30, which is a new time. Usually we're at 7, but we have lots to talk about this evening, so we extended by a half hour. So just the basics for those of you who've been with us before, or if you're new, welcome to AECEA Connect. My name is Leah, and I'm on the Alberta Early Childhood Leaders Caucus. And my co-host is...
My name is Christy Scarlett, and I sit on the board of the Association of Early Childhood Educators of Alberta. Welcome, everyone.
So we have some guests with us this evening, which I'm sure is why all of you are here, to hear the very knowledgeable people. Just help us kind of think through what this agreement means for Alberta and sort of what the roadmap could be for moving forward. So just a couple things to know before we get started. We are recording the session, so it will be made available on the AECEA website in a few days. So if you have to come in and out, or if you want to let somebody else know, the recording will be up there. We will have time for questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So you can use the question box or the chat function in your menu to put those up there. We will, when we have that time for conversation, there's a hand up button that you can use if you'd like to speak. So either one is fine. Just a reminder that when we call on you to speak, we'll unmute you on our end, but you'll still have to unmute yourself on your end. And we will just save all those for the end. So if you want to put your hand up as just a reminder that you want to say something later, that's fine, but we'll sort of, we'll ask for people's input and questions after the presentation. And really, that's all from Christy and I. So we will turn it over to Christopher and Morna, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves while I put your slideshow up.
Thanks, Leah, and thanks, Leah and Christian. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into the webinar this evening. My name is Christopher Smith, and I'm with the Muttart Foundation. We're based here in Edmonton, and we fund in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and I'm looking forward to the presentation, so thanks.
Great, and I'm Morna Ballantyne. I'm the Executive Director of Childcare Now, which is Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association. We were established in 1982, and we have been advocating for system change in early learning and childcare ever since. Glad to be here tonight.
Great, thanks, Morna. And so the presentation this evening, Morna and I are going to share the presentation as we go through. So we're going to be switching back and forth. So Leah has kindly offered to help us with our slides so we don't get in each other's way. And so just firstly, from me, I'd just like to thank the association for making this webinar available to its members and non-members this evening. This is a very exciting time for early learning and childcare in Alberta and Canada because of the announcement of the Canada-Alberta system building agreements and the agreements that have been signed now by, well, every province other than Ontario, I guess, which is where Morna is based. So, so everybody's now, the provinces are on board, and we had the Northwest Territories agreement as well yesterday. So we've now got 2 of the 3 territories as well. So this is a very important time. And as part of our presentation, we'd like to talk through a little bit about the context for early learning and childcare agreements and think through how the Alberta agreement fits into the broader context. So, but before I start, I just wanted to thank all of you, the early child educators who are joining us on the call today. Your work is of profound importance, and the historical opportunity that's available before us now through the federal investments in early learning and childcare. Hopefully, this supports your work going forward, and because you've been there for us when really the support hasn't been there, and now hopefully the support is there to build on you in terms of support your work. So as Leah said, Morna and I are going to run through a series of slides. We're going to try to save sufficient amount of time for questions at the end. And it doesn't have to be questions. It can also be comments and observations about what you hear Morna and I refer to, or maybe what you don't hear us refer to that you think needs to be brought to our attention. So could I get the next slide, please, Leah? So just as part of the presentation, what Morna and I are going to do is we're going to try to run through, see sort of 5 topics there. We're going to talk briefly a little bit about the federal budget announcements in 2021, April 2021. The budget was called a Recovery Plan for Jobs, Growth and Resilience, and did include the announcement of this historic new investments in early.
Christopher, I need to interrupt for a minute. We have lots of people, I'm sorry, we have lots of people saying that they can't hear anything, and that the webinar is saying that the webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. So I'm hoping that our techie people can take a look at that and let us know if we're ready to go.
Okay, so we just pause then, Janet, right?
Yes, please.
And Chris, I don't think they heard any of it, so we'll have to start again.
Okay. So if you remind me what I said. Okay.
Mine says on air and showing screen, so I don't know what we have done.
It's being recorded as well.
Yeah.
Can you stop the recording and then restart it maybe?
I don't know if I can, because the recording automatically starts when the session starts, and so I could possibly end it and restart it, like end our whole session and restart. If I go back to,
I don't see anything either on my end here.
because I'm not sure.
Well, it's a private group amongst us, I guess. Things, hang on a sec.
Okay, I will try ending. Well, I'll end my, and it might end for everybody. And then I'll go back to go to and log back in and see if it will let me restart everything.
Do you think you need to put a note about that in the chat? Because I have a feeling nobody can hear you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just writing the note.
Okay. Because if they can see the chat, it's interesting they can see the chat, but they can't see everything else, Janet.
Or I don't know that they can see the chat, but they seem to see the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, and usually, yeah, they can see the questions, but I'm just surprised that if the webinar is not started.
Yeah, nobody's putting anything in the chat. They're putting everything into the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and usually that's where it goes, I think. I think actually we only have access to the chat. So are you guys all right then if I turn off and turn back on?
Did we send something in that chat? Janet, did you get it sent? Okay, perfect. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'll see.
Oh, there's a stop recording.
Do you have a stop recording?
I have a stop recording. Should we try that?
Sure.
It's fine. I don't even know who to call if there's an issue. Dawn?
Okay, I have the start webinar button again. And I think everyone is still here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We will try this again. Now? Do you want me to share the AC slide again, Christy, and we'll start all over?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Let's see if they can hear us.
I haven't started, so I'll just share my screen and then start the webinar. Oh. We're back.
Yeah, we should be good now. We didn't hear that the last time.
You're
okay.
Right. Everyone, yay! Woo!
We did it.
Thank you for
Welcome, everybody. Sorry about all of our technical glitches today. We're missing our tech guru, Laura, so.
We miss her a lot.
Welcome. Yes. So we're glad that you could join us and you were patient through our many difficulties, but here we are. So thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're starting a little bit late, so I will not talk very much at all so we can hear from the people we want to hear from. Just reminders. First of all, who am I? I'm Leah, part of the Alberta Early Childhood Leaders Caucus. And
I'm Christy, and I sit on the AC board.
yay! So thank you for being with us tonight. We also have Christopher Smith and Morna Ballantyne with us, and they'll be talking to us about the Alberta's roadmap and sort of the potential of what could happen as we move forward in our development of the childcare plan with the federal dollars. So a couple of reminders from our end. We will record the session and it will be made available on AECE's website afterwards in a few days. And we will have time for questions and comments at the end. So please use the hand up function or use the question box. To do that, we do have a moderator for our question box who will be checking in on that. And then if you do want to speak later on, we'll call on you to speak. We'll unmute you from our end and you'll have to unmute yourself from your end. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. I'll let them introduce themselves and I will get the slides going.
Great, thanks, Leah, and welcome everybody. Hope I'm more impressive with sound than I am without. So I know I'm Christopher Smith from the Muttart Foundation. We're based in Edmonton, Alberta, and we are interested in research in early learning and childcare. So thanks for joining the webinar, everyone.
And I'm Morna Ballantyne. I'm the Executive Director of Childcare Now, which is Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association. And I'm delighted to be here tonight with you. Thanks for the invitation.
So Morna and I are going to share the presentation this evening. We're going to go back and forth, and then Leah's going to help us with the slides. And there's an interesting slide at the moment, Leah, that's I'm not quite sure what that is. Oh, that's good. That's okay, so Leah's going to help us with the slides. And before I start, I would like to just thank you as early child educators for your work in support of children and families across the country. I think what we all hope with the federal announcements is that we're on the cusp of some historic change in early learning and childcare in Alberta and across the country. And your work as early child educators has got us to this point, and hopefully now we can all support you better in your work as we move forward in terms of supporting children and families. So thank you for all your work. As part of the presentation today, if I can get the next slide, Leah, please. As part of the presentation today, Morna and I, we're going to go a little bit back and forth, and we're going to try to talk about sort of 5 major areas with a focus primarily on the roadmap itself, of course. But we'd like to start off a little bit, just talk a little bit about Federal Budget 2021 from released in April, which seems like a long while ago now. The budget was entitled A Recovery Plan for Jobs, Growth and Resilience, and included historic new investments in early learning and childcare, which really set the context for the work that we're all going to talk about today. Secondly, we're going to talk a little bit about the Canada-Alberta Agreement, which was released or signed on November the 15th. We haven't seen the full text of the agreement yet. But what we have done is we've heard both the federal and provincial governments speak to it, and the Minister Schultz has provided more details through one of her town hall meetings. So we'll talk a little bit about what we know about the agreement. Then for the bulk of the presentation, Morna and I will focus on the Alberta policy roadmap itself. We'll try to talk through what we think are some of the big ideas that are behind the roadmap, and we'll look specifically at the key policy actions that are included. There are 28 of them in the document, and we aren't going to go through all 28, so that's probably a huge sigh of relief for everybody, including Morna and ourselves. But we'd like to give you a sense of what the roadmap's trying to do in terms of charting directions. Then we'll talk a little bit about the Government of Alberta's initial investments that it's announced. I put system building in inverted commas because I'm not sure it really is system building at this particular point in time. And I think all of you have probably been as confused as I am by some of the announcements and some of the challenges around implementation. So we can talk a little bit about those. And then finally, we'll look ahead for what we hope can happen with the roadmap being part of the work that lies ahead. So next slide, Leo, and I'm going to turn it over to Morna.
Great. So what we thought we'd do is start with a quick overview of what the federal budget, the 2021 federal budget actually said. As Chris said, it was a budget that was introduced in April 2021, and it was a budget that was adopted by the Parliament of Canada. And in fact, there was almost no opposition to that budget. As Chris said too, the theme of that federal budget was a recovery plan for jobs, growth, and resilience. It's important to reflect that the 2021 federal budget, which made a historic federal commitment to early learning and childcare, was done in the context of the pandemic and recovery from the pandemic. So one of the main reasons I think that we saw in that budget such a big spending commitment and part of the federal government, a new spending commitment, in addition to previous spending commitments that were first made by the Liberal government in 2017. The 2021 budget added another just under $30 billion for early learning and childcare over 5 years. And very importantly, it made a commitment to ongoing federal support for early learning and childcare beyond the 5-year period, so beyond 25-26. And the budget speaks to a minimum ongoing federal commitment of $9.2 billion a year after 25-26. So it's the first time in Canadian history that a federal government, first of all, has put a huge amount of money into early learning and childcare, but also beyond a 5-year period, said that, we're in this not just for now, not just for the next 5 years, but forever. Now, can a government ever commit to forever? There's some important other pieces to the budget, and that is that it also promised to introduce early learning and childcare legislation that would make investments, continued spending law, federal law. So to end spending, presumably that would mean a future parliament would have to actually change a law, and that's of course much more difficult than just pulling the plug on spending. So what we saw in the 2021 budget in the context of the pandemic was a big increase in funding and funds that would be transferred to the provinces and the territories for the specific purpose of putting in place and building a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare. So the money would not be transferred to the provinces and territories without strings attached. There would be conditions attached to this funding, and those conditions would be negotiated in the form of federal provincial agreements. And these agreements have come to be known as the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Agreements. And as Chris said, there are now agreements signed between the federal government and 11 jurisdictions, 9 provinces and 2 territories. We expect the agreement with Nunavut to be announced fairly soon. Negotiations are proceeding well. There's no big obstacles to the signing of an agreement with Nunavut, except for Nunavut is a complex territory like the Northwest Territory, huge land, very small population, very remote communities, very high labor shortages. I know this might be sounding like Alberta, but it's Alberta and much more, even worse, the Alberta situation. So what the federal government did in its budget was get a spending authority, and it then immediately proceeded to negotiate agreements. The first one was signed with British Columbia, and that was only in July. So in 5 months' time, which is quite amazing, the federal government has actually successfully negotiated agreements, and all of these agreements look somewhat the same. What they do is they fulfill the federal government's objectives that were set out in the budget. So one big objective was to make early learning and childcare. So this would be childcare or early learning and childcare for children under the age of 6, make it more affordable for parents by bringing down or making sure that the provinces and territories put in place mechanisms to bring down parent fees by 50% by the end of 2022, and to an average of $10 a day by 25-26. There was also one of the objectives that the federal government set in the federal budget that's reflected in each of the agreements is the expansion of regulated childcare, primarily in the not-for-profit and public sectors. And Chris is going to go through the agreement that was signed with Alberta, and that is also reflected in that agreement. And very importantly, the federal government said you can't actually have a quality system of early learning and childcare without addressing all the challenges that are in the way, what we call workforce challenges that are in the way right now of not just growing regulated childcare, but actually sustaining what we have. And so the federal government said that this money, some of this money, would have to go into addressing these workforce challenges. And there was specific reference made to the very low compensation paid to early learning and childcare educators and others who work in the sector, and also to the need to put money, public money, towards training and professional development. So those were all the things that were very specifically, explicitly referenced. The other thing, of course, was Indigenous early learning and childcare. It said that the government in the budget committed to $30 billion of new funding. $2.5 billion over the next 5 years is earmarked to support the Indigenous early learning and childcare framework agreement that was worked out by the federal government, the Inuit National Organization, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Métis Nation. So this was a huge amount of money. Federal government said it's an opportunity for transformative change, but I just want to keep stressing it was all in the context of the pandemic. So a major objective of the federal government through this was actually to support the re-entry into the paid labor force of a very large number of mothers with young children who were forced out of the paid labor force by the pandemic. And also part of it was the federal government's understanding that if something wasn't done to transform the sector, then it would continue to be fragile, and really saw that it was the fragility of the sector that made the pandemic so damaging to the sector. So Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Mona. I'll grab the next slide, please, Leah. And as we're going to the next slide, I mean, I was one of the individuals who was fortunate to be in the virtual lockup, which is kind of a new concept when the budget was announced. And I must be honest, myself, Mona, and I know Don Giesbrecht was there from the Federation. I think we were all taken back by the size of the level of federal investment. This was beyond what we had anticipated. So I just want to keep reflecting on that. So as we all know, Alberta, I shouldn't say finally signed an agreement because we've beaten Ontario and New Brunswick. Alberta signed its agreement on November the 15th to access the federal monies. I think it's fair to say in the run-up to signing of the agreement, there was some fairly significant politicking, I think, on the part of the provincial government in terms of its comments in response to the federal budget announcements. And maybe that's what we always see in federal-provincial relationships. But at the end of the day, Alberta did sign an agreement, and I think there was a fairly significant amount of pressure from individuals in the sector and from parents saying, you know, we need to look at affordable, high-quality childcare in Alberta, just as we do in other regions. So it's really important that when Alberta finally signed, we were the 8th province, as Mona mentioned. If you think of going back to the election, which also seems like a long while ago now, in terms of prior to the election, there were 3 provinces that were holdouts in not signing, and that was Alberta, New Brunswick, and Ontario. And they all have sort of similar conservative governments in office. And I think there's something to that in terms of why they were a little bit slower signing. But we've signed an agreement, and as part of the agreement, as you're all aware, what the federal investments mean is it means an additional $3.8 million over the next 5 years to support early learning and childcare in the province. And then, as Mona said, there are additional funds that are coming. Now, we don't know at the moment how that 3.8 billion is staged across the 5 fiscal years. What we see in other agreements is that the initial fiscal year, this the year 21, 22, that's the lowest investment, and then as we get to up to 25, 26, the level of investment rises. But what we do know, even looking at that level of investment that we see there now, we know that this federal investment, this makes the federal government the senior funding partner for early learning and childcare in Alberta. The provincial budget's just under 400 million. And so the federal government is now the senior funding partner. And that 3.8 billion, that does not include, as Morna referenced, does not include the previous money committed under the multilateral early learning and childcare framework agreement. So the federal government is now the senior funding partner. And as Morna said, in the budget, it's outlined a very ambitious agenda for looking at change within the sector. And if we look at what we do know in terms of the allocation of investments that's currently been made available, so you see the figures there, that the majority of the funds in Alberta are being allocated to lower parent fees. The language around what that actually means and looks like is a little bit general, but it's talking about an average 50% reduction of parent fees starting in 2022, with then the transition to an average parent fee of $10 a day by 25, 26. So if you look at the numbers, so 75% of the federal monies in the Alberta agreement are being allocated to reduce parent fees. Going down, expansion of spaces. The Alberta agreement commits to the expansion or the creation, we often use the word creation of spaces, it's an interesting term, but the expansion of services with the addition of 42,500 new spaces is $240 million and allocated to that. And now that's not a lot of money. If you think about 42,500 spaces, that's not a lot of money. If you looked at that per space, that's about $5,700 a space. So that money might be a little bit thin. There's 202 million just over for childcare for vulnerable populations. This includes children with exceptional needs. And then there's 306 million allocated for what's called quality investments, and that includes investments in the workforce. But in terms of the investments in the workforce, a little bit of disappointment there. There's reflection or comments on professional learning and training and improved certification. But at this point, the government of Alberta hasn't committed to look significantly at new investments in compensation. And so if you look at that 306 million, if we were to look at even a $1 an hour increment for ECEs across the province, that would cost us around $25 million. So there's not a lot of money in that particular line item. And then if we just look to what we now know has been announced in terms of the affordability measures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these later on. I think you probably all, I mean, you're wrestling with these now in terms of how that makes sense. So we have, the government has announced towards the end of November some new operating grants. I'm not sure they're actually operating grants. We can debate that, whether they're actually an operating grant. And it's also indicated the new revised parent fee subsidies. So in terms of the Alberta agreement, we're out of the gate and we've got some big numbers in terms of investments that are on the table. But now we have to start thinking about how can those investments be actually used to support system building. And I think as Mona and I think you've all sort of thought this through as well, in some ways, the easiest thing is signing an agreement. That wasn't easy, but that's the easiest thing. The hardest thing is now going to be talking about how we actually move towards a system of early learning and childcare, moving away from a market-based sector. So I'll stop there. If we can get the next slide, please. Yeah.
So we've made reference, and this webinar is about our roadmap to a quality early learning and childcare system in Alberta. So what is this roadmap? Well, after the federal budget announcement of this huge amount of money, this $30 billion of new money added to other money, and we knew that there was going to be negotiations between two levels of government to decide how the money would be spent. Those people involved in the childcare sector, in the early learning and childcare sector, childcare advocates like myself, longtime childcare advocates, decided that it would be really helpful to, in advance, have some sense of what we think should be done with all this new money and what kind of changes we want to see. So we all are familiar with the problems, the crisis in early learning and childcare that exists in Alberta and that exists in in every jurisdiction in Canada. We know about high fees, and we know about very high turnover and the problems of retention and recruitment. We know that there's not enough regulated childcare, but what's not always clear is what is the solution. And for the last 50 years, we've had these problems, and what governments have done is really put together kind of Band-Aid solutions. They've said, okay, well, we'll put a little bit of money here, or we'll put a little bit of money there. There's never enough money. And sometimes where they put the money is not necessarily where it's going to make the biggest difference. The other problem with the way governments in the past have approached early learning childcare and addressing all the problems is they haven't understood the connections, for example, between making fees more affordable for parents and also raising the quality of the programs and making sure that those who work in the sector are adequately compensated and making sure that the programs are really inclusive of all children and so forth. That they've tended to say, well, okay, we're going to put this money to this problem and this money to that problem, and not to actually rethinking and reimagining how the whole system could operate better for children, for those who work in the sector, and also for parents, and also a system that would actually work so well that it really would serve as a really robust bridge for parents, and particularly mothers with young children, to be able to either enter the paid labor force and stay in the paid labor force. So in other words, build a system that actually will allow for economic security for families, children included, and also economic growth, because economic growth depends on people accessing and being part of the paid labor force. So when we saw all this big public money coming the way of the early learning and childcare system, a number of organizations got together, and in Alberta, it was the Canadian Childcare Federation, the Childcare Now nationally, Muttart Foundation, and the YMCA of Northern Alberta came together and said, well, maybe what we should do is speak and consult with all the stakeholders involved or representatives of different constituencies within the early learning and childcare sector and in communities, and say, well, how do we think early learning and childcare can be transformed? And what is our vision of a really inclusive, affordable, high quality system of early learning and care? So we got together, had consultations, and developed this roadmap, which is essentially saying, this is what we have now, this is where we want to go. So there are ideas and our vision of what we need in Alberta, and what kind of public policy, like what does government have to do and think about in order to be able to get from where we are now to the vision that we have? What kind of planning has to go on, and what kind of management responsibilities for the system have to be undertaken, and by whom? Also, what kind of financing has to go in? So we know we have the federal government, we know that we have, Alberta is another funding partner, but how should that money actually flow from government to providers or to the system? And how much? How should it be determined how much money should flow? And very importantly, how do we make sure that the workforce, the people who are central, the early childhood educators, how can we make sure that the system supports you so that you can support the system? So we really came at it as, we want things to be very different, but we better put down on paper how we think it needs to be different and how we're going to get there, and build a lot of support for this vision so that we can influence all the decisions that are going to be made by government and others over the next 5 years and beyond. Because we know from the experience of other countries and other jurisdictions that have built truly universal high quality systems, I hate to say this, but it does take decades. We also know that from our own experience with public education and with the healthcare system. It's never perfect, and it was certainly not perfect right from the start. It's a work in progress. And so this roadmap, this idea of the roadmap, is to sort of guide us And to try to get us all together advocating for the same kinds of policy changes so that we have a better chance of achieving them.
Thanks, Mona. And so I think we've all read many of the same things that really identifies Canada as a bit of a laggard in terms of thinking about early learning and childcare systems and policy development. And so there's one advantage of being a little bit late to the party. You actually get to learn from the experiences of others in terms of building these systems of early learning and childcare. What are the key elements or features of these systems? And as Mona said, we do actually have the ability to look at other jurisdictions and to sort of examine how they've actually approached early learning and childcare to get to the position where they do have something that's approaching a fully publicly funded, accessible, high quality, affordable early learning and childcare system that serves all children and their families. And if we look across the really the international domain, what we see is it's the Scandinavian countries, not surprisingly, that come to the fore. But there's also lots of good research that's been done by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There's a series of Starting Strong studies, which I would strongly encourage you to look at. I think we're now at Starting Strong 6, which is the most recently released issue. And these studies, they tell us some of the characteristics or features of really high-performing early learning and childcare systems. And one of the first features of those systems is that they actually recognize and approach early learning and childcare as a public good. They see early learning and childcare done well as being in the public interest. They see it as providing benefits for children, they see it as providing benefits for families, but they also see it, as Mona talked about, they see it providing broader benefits for communities and societies at large. So early learning and childcare within high quality early learning and childcare systems, it's something that's publicly valued and it's publicly supported. And it's also, so those systems are supported through significant levels of public funding, public management, and public planning. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the roadmap. And so what the key there is that these systems, they move away from the reliance on markets to organize and deliver services, where childcare is a service or a commodity that parents buy in a marketplace, to much more of a public system. And if you think of public systems, maybe we think of systems like education. A parent's access to education for their young child, their school-age child, is not linked primarily to their ability to pay. It's linked to more of the sense that this is a public good, and we need to organize and deliver these services in ways that make them accessible for all parents and all families and all children. There's also a strong focus on public funding for the services and infrastructure themselves, rather than the reliance on parent fees. So what we see is, if we look at the Alberta model at the moment, if we look at the Alberta childcare sector, and we say this is probably $1 billion sector, how much of that $1 billion in terms of revenues costs, how much are parents paying? Well, parents are paying currently 60% plus of the cost of services. Parents are the primary source of revenue in organizing, financing, delivering services. And in early learning and childcare systems, we see that turned around, where parents are not the primary source of revenue. Parents are some smaller source of revenue, and the primary source of revenue is public money. And that public money funds the services themselves, but it also funds the infrastructure that supports the services. So it's a very different change around model. What we also see is in these early learning and childcare systems, what are their key features, is that we see that we have well-prepared, fairly compensated, and professional early child educators who are recognized and valued for the work that they do. We see higher levels of education. We see a commitment and a move over time to the introduction of a proportion of staff who are degree qualified. And we see that these early childhood educators are recognized not as sort of technicians who work with children and families in poorly resourced environments, but are supported as well-resourced, well-educated professionals. And that they're the essential foundation of an early learning and childcare system that is high quality. And what we also see, you'll see it on this slide, you see the word public a lot. You'll see the sense that as part of systems of early learning and childcare, we have the same kind of public engagement. I use the word democratization. We have the same level of public involvement, public participation, public decision-making that we see in things like education, in the sense that because we recognize that early learning and childcare is a public good, it's in the public interest, then what that means is that there needs to be public engagement, public decision-making, public involvement in key policy matters. And so what we see in these systems, we see a shift, if you like, away from things that are more privately developed and privately paid for in a kind of a service or a commodity relationship to much more of something that's public. It's got a public footprint, it's got public engagement, and it's got public characteristics in the sense that all of us as stakeholders in this public system, just as all of us are stakeholders in public education and public health, we're all stakeholders in early learning and childcare, because early learning and childcare is as important to children and families and communities as is public education. So this is a really significant change. This is not just a technical change. This is a cultural change in how we think about and how we understand early learning and childcare. And as we move forward in terms of the system, this is the kind of the nature of the change that we're going to take on together. And the thing, as Morna said, we are all in this together. When the federal government outlined its initial big ideas and plans for moving forward, it did not say we're moving forward by subtraction. It did not say we're moving forward by taking people out of the equation. It said, no, the early learning and childcare sector, we're in this together in terms of moving forward. So can I get the next slide, please, ma'am? So the roadmap. So the roadmap that Morna mentioned, maybe it's a little bit of an intimidating document, but I hope that you're able to download the document and to read it and to discuss it with your colleagues and your peers, because this is a roadmap that the 4 organizations have developed to speak to all of us, to help us understand how we can all be part of this transformational change, moving from an early learning and childcare sector to something that actually functions and operates as an early learning and childcare system. And as Morna said, this was based on discussions with stakeholders over the summer, but it was also based on that 20 years or so of research in talking and thinking about how we might organize early learning and childcare services more effectively in ways that address those long-standing, those deep-rooted problems that Morna referred to. For those of us who've been working in the field for 20 or 30 years, the problems that we see around recruiting and retaining qualified staff, the problems that we see around affordability, the problems that we see around access, they're not new. Those problems are not new. And so what we now are in a better position to address is how do we actually move forward in making the changes that are going to address those deep-seated problems. We know it's not a matter of tinkering around the edges and redoing things a little bit different, putting another Band-Aid on. This is about thinking through much more thoroughly, much more comprehensively how we approach early learning and childcare differently. And this is what the roadmap actually speaks to. It includes, there's 28 different policy actions that are recommended. And what's important about those policy actions, Morna and I are going to talk through them in terms of sections, but what's important about them is that it's not that you just do one set of actions in one section. You have to look at all of these actions at the same time. There's a whole series of moving parts that link affordability to quality to access. And if we focus on just one element, access, or one element, just affordability, and we don't address on how those elements are linked together, then we're not really building a system. We're addressing a problem called affordability. And I would argue that unless we build a system, we will actually never thoroughly address a problem called affordability. We'll just come up with a shorter term solution. So in the roadmap, there's a series of different sections. There's 4 sections, and the first section talks about vision and guiding principles for early learning and childcare. And wouldn't it be amazing if we think about a system of early learning and childcare, should we not have a vision about what that system's going to look like? Should we not have broad goals for what we want that system to achieve in terms of children and families and community? And if we look across the jurisdictions, Canada and Alberta is no different. There's a sense that currently we don't have clearly stated visions for our early learning and childcare sectors. So we need to start off with a vision, and that vision needs to include reference to a commitment to high quality, affordable, accessible early learning and childcare for all children and families. It needs to include the recognition and the valuing of the workforce who provide those services. And it needs to say, as Morna said, it's very important when we think structurally about how do policies get developed and how do investments get sustained through governments. And this means that we have to think about legislation. How do we actually embed within legislation principles and guidelines for how early learning and childcare services are delivered, and how do we express those in commitments? So in that policy section, that initial policy action sections, we talk about a vision, I hope it's a shared vision. This would be something that we should all talk about, because this is going to be important. It's going to drive our initiatives. But we also talk about legislation, and we need to have legislative commitments. If you think about public legislation, public education, there's legislative commitments for an entitlement to access to public schooling. Do we need that same kind of commitments in early learning and childcare? And if we do, then we need to embed them in legislation. So this is about thinking about, if you like, first principles. What is bringing us to early learning and childcare as an area of a public good? And how do we ensure that vision is shared? At the moment in Alberta, if we look across government documents, there's references to guidelines and parameters, matters to be considered in legislation. There's reference in the ministry business plan to goals and objectives, but there is no strong vision for early learning and childcare in this province. There is no commitment to an entitlement to all children to have access to early learning and childcare, and there's no reference to a system. There's no acknowledgement of the importance of a system. So the first section looks at vision and principles, and I hope that we can all think about those and talk about those, because those are the basis for how we're going to move forward. The second section introduces something that you've probably heard, certainly folks like me talk a little about. It's about public planning and management of services. And this is, if you like, this is that both a technical and cultural shift. And what we're talking about here is we're talking about a different relationship between governments and the services that deliver early learning childcare and the staff that work in the field. What we're talking about is the sense that if this is truly public, if this is truly a public system that's in the public interest, then what we need to see a much greater involvement of government in terms of supporting, planning, managing, guiding, and supporting service delivery. At the moment, governments across Canada, in terms of their support of early learning childcare, they actually focus on more a kind of a passive management or passive regulation, passive oversight. So periodically we see initiatives, and those of us who've been in Alberta for a long while, we've seen initiatives around space creation. We've seen initiatives around affordability. We've seen initiatives around quality through the flight framework. But what we haven't actually seen over a sustained period of 30 years, 3 decades, Mona says it's going to take us 3 or 4 decades to build a system. What we haven't seen is that in government engagement with a big public plan, a big public sense of managing. We haven't seen, if you like, comprehensive and coordinated policies around how we support services. So the Ministry of Children's Services, it's going to have to take on a very different role. If you look a little bit at today, what we're thinking about now in terms of the announcements that from the ministry about operating grants and subsidies, at the moment, the ministry's now got to move from its current model to a model where it sets up grant agreements with something close to 1,800 organizations, and it's going to have to process subsidy applications for 70,000 families. This is a whole new set of investments and a whole new set of involvements for the ministry, but it needs to go way beyond that. It needs to go on how does government support the public management and planning of services such that services meet the needs of children and families, and such that services are supported to meet goals of affordability, accessibility, and equality. This requires public policy. This requires public policy around perhaps how fees are determined in childcare centres. It certainly requires public policy around how we actually match the supply of services to the demand. This is a new cultural shift, and this is what we mean by public, I think. And so that's the first area. What we also need when we look at public management and planning the roadmap, what we acknowledge is what Mona references, that we acknowledge that the Alberta early learning and childcare system, or the non-system, the sector, is entering a phase of system building with considerable financial and operational instability. The last 21 months have been a tremendous ordeal for early learning and childcare sectors across the country. And as early learning and childcare sectors, service providers and staff, we are entering a system building phase with a lack of stability and a lack of financial security. So the roadmap speaks to the need. We need to address that lack of stability in the sector before we move forward to system building. We can't build systems if we don't have strong foundations upon which to base them. So we need to recognize that there needs to be an effort, attention placed to stabilizing the early learning and childcare sector. We also need to recognize that if we are going to plan and manage the expansion of services, then that's going to take a lot of intentional effort on the part of government working with service providers to make sure new services are developed in the communities where they're most needed. We also need to make sure that those new services that are developed, they're actually sustainable services. It's not just a matter of developing more services per se, it's a matter of developing sustainable services that are of a high quality and meet the needs of community. That's going to require planning and management. And what I would suggest to you is that when we think about that management and planning and expansion of services, we're going to have to think a little bit differently from how we've traditionally thought about services being organized and delivered. In Alberta, we currently have around 1,800 organizations involving services for children 0 to 6. We have another 1,000 looking at services for school-age children. As we move forward, are we going to create another 1,800 organizations to deliver services? Or are we going to think what are new ways of thinking about service delivery that perhaps involve levels of government, different relationships with school boards? How are we going to do that? It's going to be very difficult to move forward if we replicate the models that we currently have in place. So we need to, again, think about planning and management and expansion in a very intentional way. We also need to recognize in Alberta that we have an incredibly important out-of-school care system. We have a part-day kindergarten program for children 5.5 years of age. And so part of our early learning and childcare system in Alberta includes out-of-school care. How are we going to interface federal investments for children 0 to 6 with investments for out-of-school care? Out-of-school care programs support children in families who are also accessing childcare. So families, it won't make sense to families if we say, okay, we've got something really different for your child who's 0 to 6. But by the way, your 7-year-old, 8-year-old, they're going to be part of some other sector. No, we need to think through that planning and management expansion that integrates our services. And what we also need to think about as we plan and manage an early learning and childcare system that's truly public, is we need to think through what does that nature of public input and participation look like? How are we going to ensure that in building a system, we actually provide opportunities for parents, for families, for communities to provide comment on what the services need to look like to meet their needs? And so this is part of building that system. It's about a new cultural shift towards saying that there's going to be a much greater public emphasis in terms of how we do that. Now, that does not mean there's not private delivery. There will be private delivery, but the private delivery will take place within the context of a public system where we're talking a lot more about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And we're also collecting data and reporting to the public on how well those public investments are being used to support change. So in that particular section in the report, there's 11 different policy actions, because this is an incredibly important area to get right. This is the essence of transformational change, the shift away from a market to something that's publicly planned, publicly funded, and publicly supported. And that's going to take a cultural shift. It's not just a technical shift, it's a cultural shift of how we think about early learning and childcare services, how we see them embedded in our communities. So if we can get the next slide, please, and I'll pass it off to Maura.
So if we're rethinking early learning and childcare and moving towards putting in place a system of early learning and childcare, then we have to talk about money, the financing, and we have to talk about the workforce. That's you, the early childhood educators. And we need some big changes in both those areas. And of course, both those areas are interconnected and related. So what the roadmap proposes is to rethink the funding of early learning and childcare in Alberta. And what we set out in the roadmap is the idea that regulated services need to be fully publicly funded, and that the public funding, that's the government funding, has to be a transfer to the providers of the service. And so what we call supply side funding. So, you know, what we have is a demand side, which is parents who are demanding the service and use the service. And then we have the side of early learning and childcare, which is the supplier side, the people who are actually providing the service. And what we want to do, if we're talking about moving from a market system to a publicly funded, publicly managed system, it has to be a system that is fully publicly funded. And the level of funding, we say, has to be determined, has to be set according to what funding is required to be able to offer a really high quality, inclusive, accessible service for children and for families. So you know how funding often works is governments decide their budgets, and when they decide their budgets, they look at what they spent previously and they either subtract or they might add a bit. And what we're saying, this approach has to change. What really has to happen is we have to figure out, okay, how much would it cost to publicly fund a high quality service, and that should be the level of funding. Now there's going to be a big gap between existing level of funding and what's really required in the way of public funding to offer a high quality program. So there might, you know, the funding proposal might take a few years to go into place, but these are the guiding principles that we're proposing, is a fully publicly funded system. And the quality, the public funding of the service has to include funding for proper compensation of those who work in the sector. And it has to be sufficiently high, the public funding of the service has to be sufficiently high so as to make the service affordable to parents. So think about it, instead of putting public funding to parents through a subsidy system of one kind or another, and then giving them money to go purchase services off a market, what we're proposing is that the service be publicly funding, and in that way, that's how the fees come down. Now, Chris is going to talk about the agreement and some of that was signed, and not just about what the agreement was signed, but what the Alberta government, some of the policy decisions they have already made in terms of how they're going to make parent fees more affordable. But what we know is that one of the things they're thinking about is what they're not thinking, they've said that they're going to replace some of the revenue that providers have been relying on through parent fees. They're going to replace it with an operating grant. But the operating grant is not based on what is required to offer a really high quality program and service. It's been determined by calculations of average parents' fees. That's not what we're talking about. What we're saying is providers have to receive sufficient operational funding to be able to provide high quality service, accessible and inclusive services. So that's a huge part. We have to rethink how services are financed, how they're funded. The other important thing, and I say it's related, is the essential part of our roadmap is rethinking how the workforce is regarded. That first of all, it has to be approached that the workforce is the biggest asset that the childcare sector has. And therefore, public funding has to be put to supporting that asset, to supporting those who work, to making sure that they're properly compensated, and making sure that they have opportunities to be able to engage in ongoing professional development and training. We also know that if there's not if the compensation and if work conditions are not improved in early learning and childcare, we are going to continue to experience what we have, which is I call the fleeing of educators from the sector to other sectors, other professions and occupations. And so needing to support the workforce is not just essential to be able to sustain what we have, to provide greater stability, particularly important through the pandemic and as we get out of the pandemic, whenever that is going to be, but also really important that there can absolutely be no expansion. We can't have more regulated childcare if we do not have more qualified early childhood educators. And I really emphasize the word qualified, that what we want to do is, and through this roadmap, what we're proposing is that governments with the sector explore a whole strategy for raising the qualifications of the existing workforce and making sure that that policies are put in place and supported that would actually make it possible to increase the qualifications or train a number of people to enter into the workforce. So what we want is improvements in working conditions. We want a competitive provincial salary scale for early childhood educators. We need mechanisms to support ongoing professional learning, and we want mechanisms to increase the educational requirements for ECEs. So this is these two components, financing and workforce, again, are key issues explored in the roadmap with very specific policy proposals advanced for discussion and hopefully adoption by government.
Thanks, Mona. So the Canada-Alberta agreement, and so I think what we're all aware of, I mean, is that we've seen some very recent announcements on how Alberta will initially start to look at the complex matter of affordability. And I think it's fair to say, I don't think any of us on this call are under the illusion that the moving away from a sector towards more of a system that's publicly funded, publicly managed, and publicly planned is going to be, you know, a short-term exercise. We're aware of the nature of the length of time that it's going to be to make those changes. We're also aware of the complexity of making those changes, both technically and culturally. How do we make childcare more affordable for parents? And I think all of us on this call, we recognize the importance of making early learning and childcare affordable for parents, because we know that cost is a huge barrier. And as Mona said, making childcare affordable is not simply a matter of reducing the cost in a very simple way. It's a much more complex process of how do you actually support and fund services themselves, and how do you actually also ensure that the services that are provided are of a high quality. What we all know is that early learning and childcare that's of a modest quality does not benefit children. That does not provide benefit for children and families, and it doesn't provide a good environment for early childhood educators to work in. So yes, affordability is key, and as you saw in the agreement, 75% of the resources have been allocated to affordability, because I think that's the important, often that's the important political message, or the important political pitch, if you like, for parents, is that early learning and childcare is being made more affordable. So if we look at the new operating grants, as Mona said, the new operating grants have been developed based on average parent fees across the province. They've been then supplemented with a new parent subsidy system that has reduced the overall, the highest level of payment that was available for the lowest income families. And so what we've seen through affordability, and Rob Bushman has done some really good analysis on this, which I think is going to be made more available tomorrow through AECEA and others, is we've looked at, okay, so what does the new affordability provisions actually mean? What do they mean in terms of reducing parent fees? And they do mean reductions in parent fees across the board. But when we look at how they've been constructed, what they actually mean is that those parents and those families who have the lowest incomes, they will actually see the smallest reduction in their parent fees, their paid portion of parent fees. So the current affordability measures, I get the sense that it's a kind of a hurried initiative. It's based on calculation of average parent fees across the province. And we know there is a calculation of average parent fee, but we also know that the fees, the costs of delivering high quality early learning childcare are different in different regions of the province. We also know that they're different in different types of childcare center or different types of family childcare environments. If you think of the equivalent of a school model, if we know that there's a small school in a rural community with a smaller number of children, we know that the average cost of delivering school-based services in that school are going to be higher than in a larger new school with more children. So what we need to do when we think about affordability is we need to reflect the funding that's provided to the services needs to more closely align with the actual costs of delivering services. And then, as Mona said, we actually need to know what is the cost of delivering high quality early learning and childcare, and that is the basis upon which we should then start to think about how do we make that high quality early learning childcare more affordable for parents. At the moment, what we seem to have is a more of a hurried attempt to come up with an average calculation and an average funding formula, which I'm not sure is going to work particularly well for service providers, and it's certainly not going to work well for families when they look at their expectation that they were thinking their fees were going to be reduced by 50%. So I think we've erred on the side of rapid implementation rather than good solid system thinking about how we actually start to approach the very important issue of affordability. So I think getting out of the gate, we've made a little bit of a bumpy start. And certainly for you as service providers as well, I know you're all wrestling with questions about what do I say to parents about the fees that they're going to be paying, the parent portion, the paid parent portion of those fees in January. So we've made a little bit of a bumpy start. And why have we made a bumpy start? Well, I think some of it, if I look at these missing elements here, some of it relates to that in the sense that we didn't have a great deal of stakeholder input engagement in thinking about how we actually approached affordability. We didn't do that. Now, if we think about when the budget was announced in April, we had some particular sense of what the federal government was interested in. When we started to see the initial agreements come to place, so BC agreement in July, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland PEI, we started to see some sense of what were the key questions that we would need to be asking about how do we actually use these federal investments to support system level change. And we've missed that opportunity for stakeholder engagement early on. So let's not miss it on going forward. Now, we're probably stuck with the operating grants and new subsidy system as they currently are, and look at Rob's analysis when he's made it more available to you and see, okay, how can we improve that? Remember, system building is a long-term process, takes decades, takes lots of engagement. So let's work with what we've got and let's try to make it better. What we've also done in terms of a missing piece, we've got a limited focus on public policy management and planning again. We didn't reach out to stakeholders, service providers and say, help us understand actually how we manage and support affordability. We didn't do that. What we also didn't do, and this is very important, I think, in terms of what the operators are now saying to me and probably you, is that we didn't think about how do we stabilize the services before we move to this new funding model. We didn't talk about how are we going to do that? How are we going to address 20 months of financial vulnerability? How are we going to address 20 months of decreased or lower enrollments? We didn't financially stabilize the sector before we said we're now shifting to a new model of affordability again. So now let's think about how we make the best of the situation that we've got. And what we didn't do, what I don't see in these new affordability provisions, this new operating grant, this new subsidies for parents that are reducing their fees, what I don't see is I don't see the sense of how we're investing in the workforce. I don't see how we're actually supporting those workforce to work with these families who are now receiving more affordable childcare. So whilst they may be receiving more affordable childcare, are they actually receiving higher quality childcare? Are they receiving childcare that's going to be in the best interests of children and families? And so when we start thinking about moving forward now, bit of a bumpy start, but I think it's contingent upon all of us to say to the provincial government and to the federal government, how can we be part of making these changes better? How can we now work together to look at those affordability grants as are initially proposed? Maybe they're now the grants for 21, 22, but what does 22, 23 need to look like? What does it need to look like to improve affordability? What does it need to look like to improve quality? So I think at the moment, I would really value a greater sense of engagement, a greater sense of intentional planning, a greater sense of sharing information and trying to work together to find solutions. Because in terms of building systems, we are all part of this system. This system will be better and stronger if it's informed by evidence and it's informed by the voices and opinions and views of childcare providers and parents who access services. So I'll just stop there, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about the Alberta investments. Then I'll turn it back to Mona to end the presentations.
So Chris, just picking up on what you said, going forward, what we're hoping is that this roadmap, which is kind of an intimidating document, as Chris said, it's many pages long, but there are some key ideas. And what we want to do is find ways to discuss these key ideas with as many people as possible in as many communities as possible in Alberta. So because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is, as Chris said at the very beginning, this is a hugely exciting moment for early learning and childcare. Never before have we seen so much public funding going towards early learning and childcare. So we have money, and money always invites opportunities. The other is that it's very much on the public agenda. Journalists are talking about early learning in childcare. Parents, of course, are talking about early learning in childcare. Those who work in the sector are, I think, looking at this and saying, well, it looks like there's change, but what kind of change might it be? What is it going to bring us? What will we get out of it? So there is very high interest, I think. And what we want to do is sort of channel that interest, take advantage of that interest, engage in a broad discussion of what it could be. As Chris says, we've already seen announcements being made, and some of them may not make much sense, and some of them seem completely wrong, and some of them might seem, well, it's a start, it's better than nothing. And we have an opportunity to continue to shape. So we're hoping that this roadmap will put forward some very concrete ideas that we can bring forward to others who are organized in organizations or who work in early learning and childcare and all of its different forms, wherever, you know, and across the province. And together, you know, develop a shared vision of what we want, and together create and expand the excitement of what's possible. And I always think, you know, this is when you have, we're at an incredible moment. We are building a new system, like a public education system, like a healthcare system. We are where people were all those many, many years ago when they were first starting to talk about how healthcare or elementary and secondary is not an individual responsibility, that schools aren't going to get built anymore because people just sort of come together and decide we need a school in our community. This is the moment we are in for early learning and childcare. But it's up to us now to make sure that it's done right. Governments cannot do this alone. I don't think they know how to do this alone. I know governments often don't listen, but that doesn't mean that we, you know, if we raise our voices and are loud enough and are clear enough and are backed by evidence, that they won't listen. I'm absolutely convinced they were. So this is what we're trying to do with the roadmap, is move forward, having discussions like tonight. If you're interested in having a discussion with people you work with in your programs, we can figure out a way to help make that happen. If you're active in your community and you're, you know, active in another organization and you think they should also be talking about early learning and childcare, then we can help make that discussion happen. That's what we're going to do going forward. And of course, very importantly, we are going to be speaking to government. We're going to insist on speaking with government, not just the provincial government, but also the federal government, because after all, this is a joint project at both levels of government. These are signed agreements. There are mechanisms in the agreement. There's an implementation committee that is going to provide oversight to what happens. The funding that the federal government is giving is only for the first year and a half. The next check won't come until a proper assessment is done of what's being done and what still needs by the province and what still needs to be done. So there are going to be many opportunities for us to speak out, to be listened to, and to influence the shaping of the system. So that's what we have going forward, starting from now, and love to hear your questions and thoughts on all of this.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was super informative. So I'm sure there are lots of questions. We're looking at the question box. Some of the questions are on who are we going to present this to. So those are excellent questions that maybe we can address afterwards. I'm just going to see if you'd like to turn on your mic and ask a question, you can put your hand up. I'll go through the list and see if there's anyone there with their hand up.
There is one person with their hand up, Leah.
Oh, okay. Let me find
and
them.
Bardaben Patel, and I'm going to unmute you.
Okay.
And you are unmuted, so you can go ahead and ask your question. Looks like it's Bharti Patel for short.
Maybe we'll come back to Bharti.
So down in the question box, I'm going to hit Bernice Taylor. She's put a few in here. So she has written in, would it be prudent to connect our Working Parents Advisory Group as a conduit to our families to host a session on the roadmap for this voting group? Families as stakeholders also need to have some understanding of the investment and context for continuity.
Yeah, absolutely, Bernice. And I think it's, as Mona said, I mean, what we want is we want people to be talking about what's possible, right? I think it's very difficult to make large cultural change, but we need to have parents talking to us about what's possible, what they want in early learning and childcare, and we need to talk about what this level of investment means for early learning and childcare. And what I keep saying to folks, this is not about doing the same stuff with more zeros attached. That's not what it's about. It's about rethinking early learning and childcare. And so I think, yes, absolutely, Bernice, we should be talking to parents about early learning and childcare, because I think we often make the assumption that parents understand how services are organized, financed, and delivered. They don't. That's not something that they're experts in, but you in the field, you are, and you can talk to them about what it is that we would need to support you better. And you could ask the parents, what do you need from early learning and childcare that you're not currently receiving? So absolutely, Bernice. And I think part of the challenges, as Mona said, I mean, how do we make the document more accessible? And I think your insights on that, I mean, probably with parents, we don't need to go through the 28 different policy actions, but we need to talk about some things about parent voice, perhaps, about accessibility, about culturally safe, about how the programs are part of their community. Maybe we can talk to them about that. So we need to meet different participants, different constituents where they're at, and we need to talk about what's possible, but we should be dreaming and aiming big. This is not about being small in our thinking. This is about thinking big around early learning childcare, because early learning childcare, it's important. And this is our chance, I think, to help people understand that. So absolutely, Bernice.
All right, I'm going to just go down the list here. Bernice has got another one. The current operating grant and subsidy both are funding flow through to families. The supply side funding currently is there to add structural changes for supporting disabilities and inclusive care supports through outside contracted services. The sector without appropriate funding to ensure stability will still lose programs. How do we reach the province to hear this and put it in place? Big ask. Just wondering how we advocate as a sector.
Okay. Mona, do you want to go first, and then I pipe in, or do you want to go first? I don't know.
Well, I just want to touch back on the question around parents too, because I became an advocate as a parent, and I have to say that when I think it's true that what is uppermost on parents' minds who are accessing regulated childcare programs is the high cost, whether they can afford it, especially if they don't have access to a subsidy. But as soon as the cost goes down, and it will go down, and that's, I think, a positive thing, it's certainly not the only thing parents care about. I mean, parents are not just concerned about the high cost or what they, the fee. They're very concerned about the well-being of their children. And as Chris was just saying, they're going to be very concerned about whether their culture, their language, their children are receiving, a high quality program. Now, parents don't know a lot about what is high quality and what's not. I think there's a whole exercise and work that needs to be done with parents on that. But I think that that's one of the reasons I think it's absolutely important to engage parents in this discussion, because actually I think they're going to be really interested. How do we advocate? Well, one of the critical things is to make sure not just government has accurate information about what is happening in the sector, but that others do as well. And that's often the way you get government to pay attention, is when whole communities are talking about it, when it's a daily story in a newspaper, and especially in a community newspaper. When members, elected members, whether it's provincially or federally, know that this is a hot topic in their community, then, they're always more receptive to, or more anxious to have it paid together. But the important thing is to be very clear about what the ask is, what is the vision, be very clear and find ways to make sure that the information and the difficulty and the crisis that is experienced is very, very visible. There's all kinds of different ways to do that, very creative ways, and more straightforward ways. And also just to be persistent, to just insist on being heard and to get organized with others is really important. And that's why one of the things we want to do in the roadmap is make sure that we're reaching a very diverse, in a cross section of the population, so that governments are hearing not just from voices from from early learning and childcare, but other voices. Whether it's city council members, mayors, whether it's people concerned about social justice, about poverty. It's really important to have business voices heard on this question, because it is so critical to the economy. We certainly saw that through the pandemic. So I think that's how you get organized, and you speak out, and you insist on being listened to, and you be persistent.
And just building on that, Bernice, and I think you know this, and I think we all know this, it's not just about saying, Houston, we have a problem. It's about saying, we understand the need to address affordability, and here are some solutions. Here are some ways that we can work with the initial framing around operating grants and parent subsidies. Here's some ways that we can actually improve on that particular initial approach. So it's coming forward with solutions, I think, that have the support of the stakeholders. This is not a kind of, a conceptual exercise. This is a set of solutions that stakeholders recognize would support them and would also help families. So I think we need to bring forward solutions, not just say, Houston, we have a problem. It's a shared problem. Affordability is a shared problem. So what does the best solution possible? And I think we also need to recognize, as Mona said, we probably aren't going to get the best solution the first time out of the gate, right? We're going to continue to refine and develop. And I think that's what we need to say to government. I mean, this is a long-term process. Yes, we're all going to stumble, we're all going to have bumps in the road, but let's agree that we're going to work together to develop the solutions that are going to be the best solutions possible across the richness and diversity of Alberta.
Thank you. I think what both of you said really addresses some of the other questions in here too, that really ask, how do we get this out here? Who else should we be talking to, And I think that really connects with that. And there is someone with their hand up. So Sonia Sharma, I will unmute you if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question. Are you still there, Sonia? You do have to unmute yourself. All right.
Okay,
There wasn't, oh.
Sorry, Leah, I was going to say, it looks like her question is, my question is level 1 going to end? Also, will it impact on job prospects, as it is saying increased education?
I think what we're saying is that we want to see all early learning and childcare educators have the opportunity to improve their knowledge and skills. We're not talking about, initially, we're not saying people are out, right? We need the workforce that we currently have, and we need to invest in and support that workforce. It's not a matter of saying that workforce isn't good enough. It's saying, how do we work with that workforce to improve their knowledge and capacity? And if we're saying more training is required, then we need to support them to access that training. These are early child educators have made the professional and personal commitment to the field. The field needs to now make that commitment and investment back in them. So over time, I think we would all hope that we can increase the level of educational preparation. But we're not going to increase it by saying to folks that you're out. We're going to increase it by saying we want to help you build your capacity to become the best early child educator that you can. And that's going to take time. That's going to take time. So I'll stop there and welcome Morna's insights.
Well, we can't afford for anybody to leave, any more people leaving. So it's a non-starter to try to put in place, measures that would have people leave their jobs. We have to find mechanisms to actually keep people on the job. And there are lots of innovative programs that have been tried and that have proven to be successful, and how to raise the skills and qualifications of those who are actually working in the sector. And retention is much higher when you do that, when you work with those who are actually already in the sector working and than it is necessarily to bring in people who already have the credentials who then leave. So we have to really think through strategies, as Chris said, and this is where we need the voices of early childhood educators and everything in the sector, is what would make most sense? What is the best way? What are the obstacles, but also but more importantly, what are the solutions to addressing those obstacles, to raising qualifications of those who are in the field?
We have Natalia Lupu. You have been unmuted. You have your hand raised. So she is not connected to audio though, however, so we're not going to be able to unmute her. Let's jump down. I saw somebody else had a question. Amanda had a question. How can educators advocate for system changes even if their programs aren't having these discussions?
Well, I think through AECEA. I think AECEA is a perfect voice. It represents a broad range of stakeholders. And so I think we need to look at the ways in which we can best bring forward the arguments that we think are important. And so, yes, it would be wonderful if it was in the program you're part of, but if they're not ready for that at this particular point in time, maybe then AECEA is a good vehicle. There's also Childcare Now. There's a national organization that Morna leads, but there's a Childcare Now chapter in Alberta, a newly formed chapter that is trying to bring together diverse voices to speak to system change. So early child educators speaking alongside parents, speaking alongside center directors, speaking alongside individuals who work in the poverty or the labor movement. So I think we need to look to the vehicles. And so we use the avenues that are available to us, I think. And hopefully over time, more will become developed, right? Because people want to come to a good party, right? And I don't think we should underestimate the nature of sometimes the fear or the anxiety around change. I think unfortunately in Alberta, when the agreement was initially announced, or the federal budget was initially announced, and the discussions around the agreement, there was some misinformation about that, what that meant for early child educators and what that meant for programs. And so we need to recognize that fear, and we need to sort of meet people where they're at, and we need to talk about what is possible for early learning and childcare. I don't know about anyone, but if you've had the chance to, I've been very fortunate, when you go to other jurisdictions internationally, and you hear them talk about early learning and childcare, and you walk into the rooms that early child educators are interacting with children, you're thinking, my goodness, this is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. And in Alberta, we have one of the top public education systems in the world. We have one of the top health systems in the world. Why can we not have one of the top early learning and childcare systems? Why? What is it that prevents us from doing that? We can do it in education, we can do it in health. We can do it in early learning and childcare together. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, Jeff has put in a question. Do we have any good examples in ELCC elsewhere of governments making the switch from demand side to supply side funding?
Well, yes, we've got some models. We've seen it in other jurisdictions. And so the question always is what is the applicability of that model to Alberta? And so you've seen individual initiatives, seen initiatives even in the UK where they started saying, services are available free for a particular portion of time. We've seen it in New Zealand. And so we have examples, yeah, that we can refer to. And we also have examples from our own country in Canada, in Quebec, in terms of the model of funding there. So is each example perfect? No, absolutely not. So it's about being able to discern them. So Mona, go ahead.
Yeah, I saw Jeff's question in the whatever it's called, this fancy control panel that we have on our screens, and I was reflecting that I don't think there's any jurisdiction that has a fully developed universal system of early learning and childcare that didn't at the beginning have only demand side funding. Like I don't, I think so we can go to any one of those jurisdictions that has full-fledged system and look at how they've done it. And what we do know from and this includes the example of Quebec, and it includes some of the progress that's been made in jurisdictions like PEI, which is trying to move towards a more publicly managed and better publicly funded system, that it just, the ingredient is that governments have to take responsibility, that there has to be a policy decision that by government that it is going to actually assume primary responsibility. That does not mean government operated childcare centers. What it means is a government deciding that it's actually its responsibility to make sure that there are service providers wherever they are needed, where there are services wherever they are needed. And it's a government's responsibility to make sure that those who are employed to provide those services are properly paid. Does it mean that government directly pays them? No, but it means that governments have to ensure that there's sufficient public funding so that there can be adequate compensation. But that, it doesn't happen unless government makes it happen. That's what we know. There has to be a decision to make the switch. And so we've seen, I think, the federal government making a very deliberate decision to move in that direction. The problem that we have is that the federal government, as it keeps reminding us over and over again, does not have the jurisdiction constitutionally to go and make sure that it happens in every province and every territory. What it can do is use its spending power to then coerce, convince whatever provincial and territory governments to do it. But it is going to, it does take government. But governments are in a democratically organized society, which Canada is, do have to respond to the will of people if they're well organized to express their will. So there are lots of examples, as Chris said, but I think that's the common ingredient to all of them. And it takes time. That's the other thing. It does take time. I don't know any jurisdiction where it's happened quickly.
Well, I want to respect your time, Chris and Morna, because it is already just after 8. And Morna, I know you're in a later time zone than us. Or do you want to stick around and answer more questions? We can certainly, we do record the questions, so we can certainly put answers up on the AECE website as well to make sure that people get those responses, and maybe do that in writing rather than staying online. What works for you two? I know it, and I mean, we've used lots of people's time as well, so I want to respect that.
I'll let Mona go first because she's at 10 o'clock. And
I know.
Hey, I'm fine. This is my life. I can stay. I'm more concerned about can other people stay. I think there are a few questions, Chris, that you might want to very quickly address. Like, has it been presented to government? Will it be? That would be a quick one you could answer.
So the roadmap was sent to Minister Schultz before the end of November. It was shared with ministry staff. It was shared with Minister Gould. I had a chance to talk to Minister Gould about the roadmap. Minister Gould said to me she's really looking forward to going through it. It's been shared with Employment and Social Development Canada, which is the civil service that looks at this file. So it's been shared, yes. When we shared it, so when the 4 partners shared it with the Minister Schultz, we asked for a meeting to discuss it. That hasn't happened yet, but it's been shared. And the important thing about the roadmap is that it's discussed and it's talked about, right? It's a public document, and it's not the final word. It's the beginning word on many things, but it's not the final word on anything. The final word, as Mona said, will be written by by many of you on this call tonight. So it's a starting point. So yes, it's been shared. Go through the other questions.
Bernice has put in another question here. She says, you mentioned earlier that the federal plan indicated children's ages and under. In Alberta, we see kindergarten children being left out and really in limbo. Is there opportunity in the short term to have discussion to understand the reasonings and possibility bridge this group?
I think the answer should be yes. But I'll let Mona go ahead as well.
Well, it's yeah, I mean, I think on the age thing about why the focus on younger children is partly related to what I said at the beginning, is that this big investment really came out of the pandemic, and very much pressure on the federal government to make moves in this area to recover, to help economic recovery and to contribute to economic growth. And you know, the biggest gap in terms of labor force participation for mothers with children is between mothers with the youngest children, you know, relative to fathers with young children and fathers generally. So, you know, and also this stems from, you know, the earlier multilateral framework agreement on early living and childcare, which was also aimed at younger children. The mandate letters were issued today by the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister wrote mandate letters to each of the ministers saying, you know, what they're supposed to be responsible for, or what they're supposed to accomplish in this session and until the next election. And the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development's mandate includes making school age childcare for school age children more affordable. Now the emphasis is on affordability, not in system building, but still it's there. And I'd also, the other thing to keep in mind is the 2019 Liberal platform. In that platform, it committed to creating 250,000 school-aged childcare. So it's still definitely on the federal government's agenda. And I think it's up to us now to make sure that we push through and make it happen. And my own view is that we need to really think through what are the policy initiatives that we need to advance for childcare for school-aged children. But it's a huge area of concern, and it's something you know, that we have to address. Certainly, Childcare Now is very keen on advocating for childcare for school-aged children.
And just to pick up on that, Bernice, I think you're right. I mean, I think we do need to try to understand what was the rationale for saying that children who have enrolled in kindergarten are now no longer eligible to be, you know, supported through the operating grant and subsidy, because that's given that Alberta has a part-day kindergarten program that's publicly funded, that has a particular impact in this province that it perhaps wouldn't have in other provinces. So I think that would be a really good question to follow up with provincial government, Bernice, to try to understand what was the thinking around that particular division, because it doesn't make sense, as you've raised before, you know, for kindergarten age children who are attending kindergarten 2 days in rural school divisions. What happens for the rest of the 3 days of a week, which, you know, that's an incredibly important time for that child and her family. So yes, we need to understand that. And then, as Mona said, I've heard Mona talk before as well about when we think about early learning and childcare, we're also thinking about its connection or integration with public education. So if our kindergarten is part-time, what does that mean? How should our early learning and childcare complement or respond to that? If we had full-day kindergarten, would that make a difference? And then certainly, as the point that was raised earlier, I mean, how do we integrate out-of-school care within the early learning and childcare system and integrate that with education? So, because families have, you know, 2 children, they've got one who's 6, one who's 4. It makes no sense to them that the 4-year-old has a particular type of program and service, and the 6-year-old, it looks entirely different. I remember when our own children went from childcare, full-time childcare into kindergarten. That was probably the most difficult year, because not only did we have to find a kindergarten program, we also then had to madly scramble around and find an out-of-school care program that took the kindergarten children for not half the day, not part of the day, for the bulk of the day.
Yeah.
But the child was in out-of-school care for the kindergarten child for 6-7 hours a day. They were only in the school for 3 hours, you know. So I think we really need to think about that when we're thinking about a system of early learning and childcare. How does that system complement and interact with other systems? How does it interact with parental leave? How does it interact with supports for children and families? And so this is what we need to think through. It's not just a matter of thinking early learning and childcare on its own. And so the amazing thing is when you look at the Scandinavian countries, they think about parental leave, they think about early learning and childcare, they think about public education, and they also think about the supports for families. What does that look like in terms of how we support families? So we need to answer that question, Bernice, and we need to try to better understand it. And we need to say, you know what, maybe there's a better solution. Maybe there's a better solution, because as we think about federal funding, we should also think about provincial government thinking. I think part of the federal government's thinking is not that provincial governments take their own money off the table. It's not that provincial governments even crystallize or freeze their own funding. It's the provincial governments, such as we've seen in British Columbia, in Newfoundland, and in Nova Scotia. Provincial governments also say, you know what, we need to do better in terms of our investments as well. So it's not just a matter of one government providing all of the funding. It's what do the provincial governments also need to bring to the table to support early learning and childcare? So I'll just stop there. Thanks for the question, Bernice.
All right, we have one more in the question box, and then we have a hand up that we'll go to. Sir Iram, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm not going to put my voice on the table. If a daycare will be constructed next year, will it be eligible for the $10 a day program?
Okay, that's a question they're answering in 3 or 4 parts, right? Okay, if that early learning and childcare center daycare, if that was already in the approval and planning process, then what I've heard the minister say is that's in. If that new early learning and childcare center that's going to be developed next year is a for-profit entity, then that's a different set of discussions. If that new childcare is a non-profit or publicly owned, then it's going to have to fall within some sense of a public management and planning process. So the question relates to both the organizational structure of the entity and its current place, if you like, in the planning and approval process. So I guess the answer is maybe. That's probably.
Yeah.
All right.
I think that's one of those things we all have sort of partial information on.
Yeah. Yeah. So Donna Stazensky, I have unmuted you, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Whoa.
You are unmuted, Donna. I'm not sure what's happened there. She's lost her mic. Oh, here she's back again.
Oh, thank you. My question was about full-time kindergarten, all-day kindergarten, and pre-K, and the importance of connecting what's happening now with early learning and childcare and the public system we have in education. And I just wonder, I think there's wonderful opportunities for us to be doing things, and I'm just wondering, I'd just like to hear more about what you and Morna, you and Christopher think about that and how we can move forward and support one another in doing this. Thank you.
Okay, and I think that's a great question, Donna. Thank you for raising it. And I think, you know, when we look across jurisdictions, we often refer to these split systems where we have early learning and childcare viewed one way and early education for young children viewed another. And that makes no sense, right? And so we do need to look at the integration. So in Alberta, we've actually invested an awful lot of money in early childhood services for children 2.5 and up. And we've invested less money in kindergarten. And so we really need to think through, how does early learning and childcare, community-based childcare, interface and connect with public education for kindergarten, pre-kindergarten age students? And we need to think that through with a sense of a perspective on what's in the best interest of children and families. We are not talking about now, I think that the education system has made tremendous leaps forward where kindergarten is not meant to be a didactic educational experience where children are instructed in ways that are more formal and regimented. We see emergent exploratory learning in kindergarten classrooms supported by professional certificated teachers. We see the same kind of emergent learning and development in childcare centers. So we really need to think through more clearly how those systems are linked. And in the roadmap, we talk about some interesting ideas about, for instance, about a childcare in schools policy. So every new school that's constructed includes designated space for early learning and childcare. We also talk about how do we actually integrate early childhood services with childcare more fully. And so I think these are the big discussions that we need to have. This is an opportunity to rethink what is a false division between something called public education and kindergarten and something called community-based early learning and childcare. We need to get over that division and we need to work together. So I'll just stop there and let Morna comment.
Yeah, I agree completely. You know, this term early learning and childcare is actually fairly new vocabulary. We used to always speak about early childhood education and childcare. And we said early childhood education and childcare, not that these were two separate things sort of put together with the conjunction like the and, but that they're actually integrated. And kindergarten is part of a system of early childhood education and childcare. And it's particularly that if the kindergarten program is organized as early childhood education and childcare, not that, you know, the childcare comes before and then there's kindergarten, which is part of school, and then there's childcare that happens after the kindergarten program, but it's really seamless and it's an integrated approach. I think that's a really important thing to have, to consider kindergarten part of early childhood education. And then we have to think about the transition between early childhood education and childcare that happens before kindergarten, whatever the kindergarten age is, and to make sure that that's a good transition. So there's that whole issue. And then there's the whole issue of location, is that it just makes a whole lot of sense to have early learning and childcare, or early childhood education and childcare programs to where it, you know, to be in schools, to be available to parents through schools where that's possible. And that doesn't mean that they become schoolified, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be offered by boards of education or by the school system. There can be many, many different approaches taken. And I think that's the kind of discussion it'd be really exciting to have in Alberta and elsewhere. There's been some really great success stories with full day kindergarten programs for 4- and 5-year-old, with before and after school programs, and you know, and they've worked better in some places than others. So there's lots to learn from. But I do think it's important to start seeing, you know, education as being something and that starts at birth and never ends. So we have to think about sort of from the 0 to 12, what is the best way to organize this? We're first and foremost in the interest of the child. How is it organized around what the child needs? Then also very importantly, we have to think about how you organize it, what it means for the early childhood educators. And of course, it's important to think about how you organize it, what it means for parents as well.
Thank you so much. I don't think we have too many more questions or hands up. Janet, are you seeing hands up?
No, we are good, Leah.
All right. Well, I'm sure the conversation will continue. We have lots to think about, lots more places to get this information out to. So the links for where the roadmap is are on the slide here, but it's also on the AECE website. So definitely find the roadmap and go through it. And also certainly reach out to AECE if you'd like to have more information at your organization, or if you can think of someone that we can present this information to. We certainly want to be a part of getting the word out there. So thank you so much, Christopher and Morna. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your vast knowledge in this area. It was wonderful to hear you. So thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.